Hey YouTube, in this video we're going to be doing a review on the rasterization performance of the RX 7900 XT. So this is the cut down variant of the two Radeon 3 GPUs that did launch earlier this week. So I did do a ray tracing benchmark review video, so if you're interested in that, check the note in the video for more on that info if you missed that video. But today we're going to be looking at rasterization performance. This is going to be the one that's going to be more relevant to the entire audience, because I know there are some of you that don't really put too much stake into ray tracing, don't care about it that much, because it is still a relatively new technology. Not all games guarantee support for it, so I do think that there is a case to be made for this GPU, especially for those on 1440p. So what I have today for comparison is, obviously we're going to be looking at the 7900 XT. So this is the reference card with a dual 8-pin and the metal backplate. There's not much more to say about it. The primary previous generation card that we're going to be comparing it with is going to be the 6900 XT. So this was the former flagship, but I do have one on hand here, so we are going to be benchmarking this one in rasterization performance to see how much of a generation improvement we can get with Radeon 3. And then from the competition side, we have the RTX 3080 Ti, which makes a return from the ray tracing benchmark comparison video I did. So this is the FE model that we're going to be using. So those are going to be the same two GPUs that you guys saw in the ray tracing video. And then I've also included Intel's Arc A770. Now, this is not very price appropriate for this video, since we are evaluating a $900 graphics card, and this is a $350 graphics card, so the reference Intel Arc A770. But what I figured is I'll go ahead and include it so people can get an idea of whether or not they realize, well, I don't really need to spend $900 for 1440p gaming, and the performance numbers on this may be satisfactory based off what we're going to show. And if that's the case, then you can go ahead and pick one of these up. However, I also included the Radeon RDNA2. This is the 6700 XT. So this card was originally $479 was the MSRP. But the thing is, you can get one of these on really good fire sale right now for places like Newegg, if you can still find one. They're selling out pretty quick. I know Micro Center has a few of them, but once they're gone, they're probably going to be gone for good. They're probably going to get replaced by the newer Radeon 3 variants. But this is overall better than the Arc. We'll look at the results and the benchmarks to see how they compare. But I would say if you can find one of these for like $300, $330, maybe $350, definitely worth it. Overall, this is probably the best. It's 12 gigabytes of memory, so for 1440p, it's going to be very, very good. And then for some older GPUs, I did also include the Radeon. So this is the Radeon 1. This is the RX 5700 XT with its infamous dent there. But this is the reference design card. So I did include this for those of you that might still be rocking one of these in your gaming rig, and you may be on 1440p, or you maybe just went to 1440p, or maybe you went to 4K recently, and you realize now that this GPU is really holding back your gaming experience. So we're going to take a look and see how much of a FPS increase you get from upgrading from a 5700 XT to the new 7900 XT. Because I do feel like definitely for 4K it makes sense, but for 1440p, depending on budget, it may also make sense. And then I have two other much older GPUs. So this is going to be the RX Vega 64 with its reference card that had dual BIOS. But yeah, this one is from 2017. It's like, I think it was August 2017 was when this card launched. But yeah, this one is really long in the tooth. So if you're still on a Vega 64 and you're on the fence of what to upgrade to, you might want to take a look at these benchmark results that we're going to be showing, because I think it's going to be an eye-opener. The other thing too is if you're on a 4K monitor, or if you want to go to 4K and you're still on Vega 64, from my testing, I realized that you can't really do the maximum refresh rate you can do on Vega 64 on DisplayPort is 95 Hertz on a 4K display in order to keep the 10-bit color and the full RGB color spectrum. So that is something to keep in mind, because that kind of explains why the 2.1 DisplayPort spec on the new Radeon 3 GPUs is a good thing overall, because you can see how older graphics cards can't really drive those higher refresh rates at a resolution like 4K. So that's an interesting thing that I discovered while I was testing these cards. And then the last card I have is the Founders Edition GTX 1080. So this is the same cooler that's found on the 1080 Ti and the 1070 and the 1070 Ti. But this is the GTX 1080. This card is the oldest card that I am featuring in these comparisons. This one launched in May of 2016, making it the oldest card that I have ever kept around for benchmark purposes. But yeah, this one is still a good choice for comparison, because I do think that this card in particular covers a lot of ground in terms of showcasing the benchmark results for those of you that have something like an RTX 2060, any of those Pascal variants. This is representing the architecture from the 10 series. So yes, it's a little bit slower than a 1080 Ti. So if you're curious to know where your 1080 Ti stacks, pay attention to the 5700 XT's results, because this is the closest card in this comparison that will represent a 1080 Ti or Radeon 7. But yeah, the 1080 is kind of there to show similar, like a 1070 Ti, 2060, 2060 Super. So all those kind of cards are all covered, plus or minus some percent, based off of the results shown there. So I do think this is another card that you can't really drive a 4K monitor beyond 120 Hertz. But even at 120 Hertz, you can't get the full 10-bit color spectrum, and you're stuck running at YCB-CR 422 color space. So that is that does kind of show why newer standards, like for instance DisplayPort 2.1, are a good thing, because you can't really get the full experience out of a 4K monitor high refresh with an old GPU like this. So without further ado, let's get into the benchmarks and see if the 7900 XT is worth it. Just to kind of recap the card specs here, so you can see this is the cut down model, keep that in mind, but AMD decided to call this a 7900 XT, which is fine, because typically internally the XT is a cut down variant of an XTX. However, with the last generation, they did call their fully enabled Radeon 2 GPU the 6900 XT. So just because the naming convention is the same, we're going to compare it that way. But I do think technically the more appropriate comparison would technically be against the 6800 XT, if we're talking about a cut down XT versus a cut down XT. But that being said, you're still getting a lot of good specs on this GPU. You can see 84 compute units, 2 GHz game clock. It typically runs above that, usually like 2.2 to 2.4, somewhere in that range. A 20 gigabytes of VRAM, which I think is an excellent value for not just 4K, but 1440p definitely, because I do think with 1440p, if you're going to stay with, say, a 1440p high refresh display for the next couple of years, or next several years even, the 20 gigabyte VRAM buffer is never really going to limit you. From my tests, what I found with some of the games, like for example Far Cry 6, which we'll look at later, that game uses almost 8 gigabytes. It's like 7.3 gigabytes of RAM at ultra settings at 4K resolution. So that gives you an idea why a 20 gigabyte frame buffer is very, very good. And I know there's some of those, some people out there are probably on like a, for example, a 3060 Ti or a 3070 or 3070 Ti, and they're probably fed up with the low 8 gigabytes of VRAM, because if they're trying to max out textures and settings to get the best visual experience, they're not really able to do that, especially as newer games come out which use higher copious amounts of video memory. So this 20 gigabyte buffer on AMD is very, very good. So that's just all I have to say there. The DisplayPort 2.1 is also very good. Like I did say in the intro, newer display technologies or newer output displays like 2.1 spec is always nice to have. It's never a bad thing. if you compare this with the old Vega 64, that card couldn't really do above 95 hertz at 4K on a DisplayPort cable. The same DisplayPort cable that I'm using to test all these GPUs, and the GTX 1080 could not get the full RGB color spectrum at 4K, and the highest it could go was 120 hertz. So that's a limit of the display type spec on their controllers that they have on those older cards. So that does show why upgrading, when you do upgrade, you also want to take into account these sort of new standards, because that might come in handy later down the road when you decide to upgrade your monitor to something like an OLED or like an HDR type monitor, that sort of thing. So next we've got AV1, encode, and decode. So the encode part is the thing that's the highly anticipated thing that you hear about a lot in media for the future of streaming content from content providers like Netflix, Hulu, all the streaming services. They're eventually going to roll out AV1. Twitch and YouTube are also at some point going to roll out AV1. So right now, today, with the encoder on this GPU, just like with ARC and the RTX 40 series, you're limited to just recording either your desktop or gameplay using AV1. You can't actually stream an AV1. So I do want to iterate that, because a lot of people have asked me, can I like stream an AV1 on my ARC GPU or my new Radeon GPU? And the answer is you can, it's there, but you can't, not because of a limit on the software or the GPU, but because the provider, in this case YouTube or Twitch, will not allow you to stream at AV1. You cannot send them an AV1 encoded stream. They will reject it. So until they roll that infrastructure out internally on their side, it's only going to be used for local recording. So then finally we have a 300 watt total board power. So pretty standard stuff. AMD hasn't really changed much outside that 300 TDP window ever since Vega. They've kind of been at 300 watts since Vega 64, and they never really moved well above that, or never really gone that much below that either. So let's kind of look at the test setup here. So I am using a Ryzen 9 7950X. This was requested by some of my viewers on my YouTube channel when I was doing the live stream for the 7900X. Originally, I was testing it with the new Intel 13900K, and that was what I was originally going to do the review with, was with one of these, but I did get a lot of mentions about the Ryzen, if I could test with the Ryzen CPU, because people were telling me that the Smart Access Memory, which is basically AMD's secret sauce variant of resizable bar, gets better scaling with the Radeon GPUs. So, I wanted to go ahead and test it that way. It doesn't matter. I mean, I could test either way. It doesn't really matter. But I did want to do that because the viewers requested it. So, if you do have a request for a video, provided I do have the resources to make the video, like if I have the hardware, please leave a comment below if you want to see some other type of content, and I'll see if I can make that happen. But you can see we're testing with 64 gigabytes of G.Skill Ripjaws at 5600 megahertz. And we have the new MSI 1300 watt power supply that does support that 12 volt high power plug that can connect to a 4080 or a 4090 or a 3090 Ti. So that's a very nice power supply. I've been using it. People have been asking me in the unboxing video for that power supply, how has my experience been with that? Well, I can tell you it's excellent. I've benchmarked with all the GPUs you see in that picture down below, and I never had any issues with it. I had to plug and unplug the 8-pin cables multiple times. Never had any problem. They still are super solid when they click into the PCI power connector there on the GPU. So excellent power supply. Can't recommend it enough. It's dead silent. You can never really hear it over the case fans. So I can never even tell if the fan's spinning or not on it. In the case, the fractal torrents, nothing different there. And then, we have Smart Access Memory enabled for all of these GPUs tested, or resizable bar. And then you can go ahead and see the driver versions that we're running. The 7900 XT is currently on its own driver fork. So it's a driver that's separate from the rest of the RDNA GPUs. So when you do first install this card, you will have to download the new driver to get this card up and running. It will not work with a Microsoft provided AMD driver that auto installs, and it will also not work with the current 22.11.2, which is what I use to test all the other AMD GPUs. And then you can see the latest NVIDIA driver at time of filming, and then the Intel driver was also the latest driver that they have available as well. So what you are going to see in these benchmarks that are coming up here, you will see that ARC has improved ever so slightly in certain titles. Not in every title that I tested, but you will notice that it has improved quite a bit. So it is better than it was at launch. Alright, so the first benchmark here is going to be TimeSpy DX12. So the only thing that really stands out in this benchmark, I wanted to include a synthetic, which is the 3D Mark TimeSpy, because this one's free, so you can just download this off of Steam. Just the TimeSpy one, and then run it, and you can get results. You can kind of see how your results compare to mine that are shown on the screen. If you have one of these GPUs, or if you have a GPU that you're curious to see like where it fits in on this stack of results here. The thing that stands out to me is the enthusiast GPUs. So like the 7900 XT, the 6900 XT, and the 3080 Ti, all three of them, their graphics scores were higher than the overall score, which is the blue bar, whereas the other GPUs, the overall scores were higher. I just found that kind of an interesting observation. So if we look at the FPS numbers for the first graphics test, which is the blue one, and then the second graphics test, which is the more intense one, which is the orange one, you can kind of see the results are really good overall for the price point, considering this is a cut down variant of RDNA 3 versus the fully enabled RDNA 2. You can see there is a good margin there. Basically, the graphics test 2 on the 7900 XT is better than the graphics test 1 on the 6900 XT and the 3080 Ti. So that's really good to see. So next, let's get on to an actual benchmark. So this is going to be the first of many games that we tested here. So this is going to be DX12. So this is Elden Ring. For those, obviously, you can see the Elden Ring title. It does use the Souls engine, although this is a newer variant of their Souls engine, the latest one, based off of Sekiro and Elden Ring. They're kind of running on the same type of engine, and it's DX12 based, so I thought it was a good test. This is also my favorite game that has come out this year, so I definitely wanted to include this one. And you can see the results are really good. For 1440p, we're right at 120 max, so if you're on a 120 hertz monitor at 1440p, this is going to be an excellent graphics card to pair up with that for this game. But, the other, like the last generation, does pretty good as well, at 96 on the 6900 XT. And then even ARC and the 6700 XT, so these more like mid-range options down here from Intel and AMD, they do above 60 at 1440p. And if we move on to 4K, obviously the best result still with the 7900 XT. So it does lose a lot of FPS here, I will say, but it's still the smoothest experience out of all of them. So next we're going to look at Halo Infinite. So this is using the Slipspace engine, so I had to do a little bit of reading up on what is the actual engine, because at first I assumed that, it's probably like Unreal or something, but it's actually their own. It's like a different engine completely. It's different from Frostbite, but it is DX12, so I did want to include it here. So it's one of the newer first-person shooter games that came out last year. And you can see excellent result for the 7900 XT. So there's not a whole lot to say about it. It does really well. One thing I will say, though, is ARC does struggle in this title. I did try testing multiple times with this, did multiple runs on ARC, and I don't know what it is, it just didn't really run well, considering how new it is relative to these other GPUs that are also struggling to run this game at Ultra. And then for the 4K, you can see everything takes a huge, massive drop in FPS. However, the 7900 XT does hold really well at almost 90 FPS, so that's really good to see at Ultra. And keep in mind, very few people play first-person shooters at Ultra settings, so you can bump this down to high, and then your FPS is going to be over 100 plus on the new GPU there. So next, I included Resident Evil Village, because it is the latest Resident Evil title. It is very well optimized for not just the AMD GPUs, but it does run really well on the AMD GPUs. So I did want to kind of show that here, because you do get really good predictable scaling across the board here with all of them, even all the way down to the old Vega 64. And this is at 1440p max settings. The only thing that's disabled is any kind of upscaling or ray tracing. So excellent result, almost 300 FPS, so that's a massive number there. in terms of the average. If we look at the 4K results, you know, they all take a big hit, but the 7900 XT still delivers the best result there at 155. So not a whole lot to say. Excellent performance at 4K for the 7900 XT. Then I did include a strategy game. I don't really play a lot of strategy games anymore. Even the modern ones. I think like Civilization 6 is probably the most modern one that I have that has an option to render at DX12. But you can also fall back to DX11 on this title. So what I noticed here, what I'll say is the RDNA GPUs do pretty good. So both the 7900 XT and the 6900 XT. Although I will say that the NVIDIA GPUs did surprise me. They do really good in this title. 247 on the 3080 Ti is very close to the result on the new 7900 XT, considering that GPU is over a year old compared to this new one, and it's last generation NVIDIA, so very good showing for the Ampere GPU, I will say, at 1440p. But you can see across the board, all of the GPUs, even the really old ones, are very playable. So at 4K, still very playable for all of the GPUs tested. But like I was saying earlier, the Ampere GPU did really, really well in this title. So it's very, very well optimized. So next we look at Final Fantasy XIV. So this is my favorite game to benchmark, despite the fact that the benchmark takes a very long time to run. It's probably the longest running benchmark that I have. And you can configure, you can like create a character in it and stuff. So it's really cool. I highly recommend it for those that want a free benchmark to test. It's a very long benchmark too, so I think it's a pretty accurate one for testing for things like GPU bottleneck, CPU bottleneck, all that stuff. So it is a DX11, so this is the DX11 test that we did using the Crystal Tools engine, so it's a unique engine. You can see like all the top GPUs there all kind of clumped together above 26K. One thing I will note, if you do want a perfect score, which is considered extremely high in the score result, the number on this benchmark is 15K. If your GPU scores above 15,000, then it's considered a perfect score. So you can see going as far back as the 5700 XT, which is roughly 3.5 years old, that card does barely manage to make it over that line. It crosses that finish line and get a perfect score. So that's really nice to see on that old GPU. Arc does really well too at 1440p. And then you can see the old Pascal GTX 1080 really stretching its wings to try to reach that 15K, but just short of it. So it did score in the very high category, as well as Vega 64. So here are the actual FPS numbers. So you can see I did include minimums on this because you do get a printout score sheet at the end, like a text file that gives you the minimum and the average. So you can see the average FPS for the 7900 XT, very high, 189, and the minimum at 83. NVIDIA's GPUs do really well in this title. This is a DX11 title, as opposed to a DX12 title, but they do very good. You can see that the GTX 1080 did score very well, 94 average, and it did have a decent minimum too, considering how old that GPU is. So 1440p, excellent results, all of them. Arc also did really well, although the minimum could be better compared to its contemporaries, that being the 6700 XT. Next, we move on to 4K. So 4K at this resolution, only 2 of the GPUs managed to score a perfect, extremely high, over 15K, and that was, of course, the 7900 XT managed to do it, but then the 3080 Ti also managed to do it. So like I said earlier, NVIDIA's GPUs do really well in this DX11 title. They work really well with this engine in particular. So 6900 XT almost made it. It can probably reach 15K with a small overclock, but you know, very close, but still extremely playable for all 3 of those. Then if we look at the actual FPS numbers, you can see those are still all like 100 plus, and the minimums are really good on the AMD cards right here, and then the Ampere one did dip a little bit, and then you can see that all the other ones, really the only one that I would consider, okay, maybe Arc, but you have to turn some settings down at 4K if you wanted to average over 60 on Arc. But this is a surprising showing, you know, like Arc. I did test this in my previous review video for Intel's Arc GPU, and it didn't really change too much, still averaged the same 58. This is a good example for those of you that play MMO games like Final Fantasy XIV and are thinking of upgrading to a 4K monitor. And now you can kind of see, like, if you're on an older GPU, what you're kind of missing out on, or what you stand to gain by upgrading to one of these newer RDNA 3 GPUs, or even like a fire sale RDNA 2 GPU, like a 6000 series GPU, for example, because that's still an excellent result on the 6900 XT. Next, I did test Shadow of the Tomb Raider, so this is a title that I just kind of threw in here. It was a easy to run benchmark to rinse and repeat across the board for all of these, so you can kind of see the results here. So at 4K, you can see now anything that's not the 6900 XT, 700 XT, or the 3080 Ti all struggle at the 4K resolution. So, and that's the reason why I've been saying in live streams that I do think that the 6900 XT was designed for 4K, and of course here we can see the 700 XT does improve upon that, but I do still think that the 700 XT is better suited for 1440p if you're thinking about buying a GPU for the long term, meaning you're going to hold on to it for 3 or more years. Then you have to really think about your monitor, because I think if you're on 1440p, this GPU, you know, definitely makes sense with these results, but 4K is kind of telling in terms of you can see how much the 3080 Ti and the 6900 XT drop as you go to 4K compared to the 7900 XT. So next we're going to look at another DX12 title. So this is Horizon Zero Dawn. So this is was a Sony like first party game, I believe, that finally was ported to PC as Sony is starting to branch out. So this is an interesting one to note. So it does have a frame cap of 120 FPS. So that's the reason why you can see all three of the top performers there are right up against that limit wall there, right at around 119, 120. You can call it 120. So at 4K, you can see, so the RDNA 2 GPU takes a pretty big hit compared to the new RDNA 3 GPU. Ampere doesn't really seem as affected, which was surprising, considering I feel like the Decima engine coming from console, typically PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5. But at 4K, you can see like all the older ones, they're not really 4K GPUs. You're definitely going to need like FSR or some kind of upscaler or lower graphics settings if we're being practical to improve performance on those older ones. But man, looking at like Vega 64, even at 1440p it was under 60, so definitely long in the tooth there if you're on a Vega 64 and you're thinking about upgrading. Next we have Far Cry 6. So Far Cry 6 was an interesting one because the 6900 XT and the 3080 Ti both tied on the minimum, but they had different averages, so I had to look at the maximum to figure out like which one actually did better. Although the average is telling, right, like 135 on the 6900 XT. However, they both lose to the new 7900 XT, so even the minimum was really good there. And then, so very fluid experience there on the new GPU from AMD. You can see this is a title where Pascal, it definitely shows its age there, you know, at sub 60 at 1440p. So if you move on to 4K, you can see, again, what was interesting here was the 6900 XT and the 3080 Ti both tied on the minimum, but they also tied on the average. So I had to look at the maximum again. And this one, the 3080 Ti did barely win. It's one frame on the maximum, 92 versus 91. So, but, you know, they're roughly the same. You'll never be able to tell the difference between those two. But the 7900 XT did basically trounce both of them. Its minimum at 94 beat both of their maximums. So that's good to see on a newer GPU, and then a 103 average. So interesting game overall to test. So the overall performance, you can kind of see these are the relative performance result. If we average all of the FPS results for 1440p for all the tests that we did, this is kind of where we get. So 172 is the number for the average FPS at 1440p that you can expect on a 7900 XT. So that's the reason why I do think that this GPU is definitely a good long-term investment for 1440p, especially because of the 20 gigabytes of VRAM. Like I said earlier, in Far Cry 6, this was a game that at this resolution, with everything set to maximum, I was getting a warning saying low VRAM for all my graphics cards that only had 8 gigabytes of memory. So the 5700 XT, the Vega 64, and the GTX 1080 all were getting like a warning message saying low memory because we were taking like 7.3 gigabytes of memory at 4K on this particular game. So that shows you like the 8 gigabytes on like a 3070. This is the reason why I've been saying in my live streams that the 3070 and the 3060 Ti, those are bad value if you're gonna be playing, especially if you consider wanting to run everything at max and you want like high refresh and that sort of thing and high resolution. So that's the reason why I feel like the AMD cards are in a little bit of a better position there, considering like a 6900 XT has 16 gigabytes of memory, a 6700 XT has 12. Even Arc A770 from Intel has 16 gigabytes, so that was never VRAM limited either. You know, back to the relative. So basically at 1440p, the 1080 and the Vega 64 technically are still decent at 1440p, I'll say, because the number average was just over 60 for both. But, you know, you're definitely, if you have one of those or you have something similar to those, like a 2060 Super, 3050, 30, maybe even 3060, you're probably going to think about upgrading at some point because you're going to start noticing as newer games come out, the FPS is going to drop more and more dramatically on those older GPUs or those GPUs that do not have a lot of video memory. So that's why I've always liked AMD's cards on the hardware specs alone, because I think they always give you a lot of video memory, like, you know, 12, 16, now 20, and now 24 if we're looking at the new XTX. So very good value in terms of the hardware that they give you up front. So that's always good to know. If we look at the 4K performance, so the 7900 XT, this kind of proves that, yeah, it can do 4K just fine. You know, 121 is the average number that I got across all games at 4K. So definitely better than the previous generation at 100, but it is not that much better. So what I will say is that if you're on a 6900 XT, or if you're thinking about buying a 6900 XT new from a place like Newegg that still has them, or maybe Micro Center if they have them, you know, you could get the Callisto Protocol and Dead Island 2 for free if you buy a 6900 XT. You do not get that benefit if you buy the 7900 XT. So if you like these results, or especially if you're on 1440p, then maybe the 6900 XT at its current sale price of around, I think, like $650, maybe $700. I think I glanced at it earlier, and that's kind of what I saw on Newegg. But yeah, at those prices, definitely with 2 free games, I would get one of those over the new 7900 XT. However, if you are looking for 4K performance and long-term, you know, the 20 gigabytes of memory, the higher average today, the 7900 XT is definitely worth considering, unless you really, really want the XTX and you're willing to wait for more stock to come in. But I do think that the XTX is going to be really hard to get, at least for the next several weeks. So those are kind of like my takeaways comparing the 7900 XT to the RDNA 2 GPU. But, you know, like the 3080 Ti is also kind of there, but it's basically gone. You can't really find one anymore. And they're not really on sale anymore either. They're kind of all dried up. But yeah, that card, original MSRP was $1,200, so never really a good value. And it has less memory than all of the AMD GPUs. So if we talk about the fan noise, just real quick here. What I will say for people who want to know how to interpret what's loud and what's soft, anything above 40 dBA is going to be noticeable. I'll just say that's kind of a rough estimation or an oversimplification, but anything above 40 will be noticeable. So you can see here the blower style Vega 64 is loud at 2400 RPM stock. The 5700 XT at 2100 RPM is also relatively noisy, but a little bit, just ever so softer than the Vega. And then the other GPUs that are below 40, so the 3080 Ti is noticeable when you're benchmarking and the frame rate is uncapped, obviously. So you will notice the 3080 Ti. It is the noisiest of the axial style coolers. And then after that, it will be the 7900 XT, which does tie with the 1080. The 1080 is a very, very quiet blower style cooler, which matches the axial
noise levels on the 7900 XT, which is very interesting. But you know, the 6900 XT is the most impressive of them all. Like this 27 dBA, I was measuring this on the cell phone. This thing is whisper quiet. You know, 1100 RPMs on the fan. Like this is insanely high quality. So definitely, if you can still find one of these with the 2 free games that are included, this is definitely, it does feel like a more premium quality product, at least the reference cooler in my mind, over the newer 7900 XT. But you know, it doesn't perform as well, so there's always that. And then ARC and the 6700 XT are basically dead even. They both have very, very similar noise profile. They're both quiet, so they're both well behaved. And then for the thermals, you can see the blower style coolers are running way hotter than the rest. ARC does really good in terms of the temperature. These are all average thermals. This is not hotspot. This is also not edge temperature. These are the average temperatures that I took, looking primarily at edge temperature, but then also weighing in hotspot. So thermals are really good on all these reference cards. And then the power consumption while gaming. So I did test. What I used was GPU Z. So I took the average number. You basically click on it till it tells you average, and then you just use that to record down these values. So these are what I got. You can see, so one thing I will say here is the AMD cards, they kind of all stayed around 300 watts. You can see like the 6900 XT, Vega, and the 7900 XT, all the like flagship or top tier or upper, you know, like the high end, they're all kind of around 300 watts. Whereas the NVIDIA cards, they're kind of like gone up, right? Like power consumption on Ampere was way more than Pascal ever was. But yeah, these are kind of the numbers. So just kind of plan your power supply appropriately if you're doing a new build, or you can kind of figure if you need to upgrade or not. Performance per watt. So this is kind of the average FPS result that we took for overall. We divided that by the gaming power consumption. So this is the numbers. This is the ratio that I got. So you can see Vega, terrible performance per watt, but the 7900 XT does have the most performance per watt out of all the GPUs tested. So, but RDNA 2 was also pretty good overall. You can see even like the 6700 XT, though it is a lot weaker than the 3080 Ti, in terms of performance per watt, it's basically the same. So performance per dollar, this is kind of taking the MSRP. So this chart, right now you can get the 6900 XT for well under its MSRP, so that will change. However, the reason why I'm using MSRP is because if people watch this video like 6 months from now, a year from now, when the 6900 XT is basically out of stock everywhere and it's discontinued, so that limited deal that exists today won't stick around forever. So in terms of like, how do I present this data for long-term viewers or people who are going to view this like way, you know, months from now, I do need to kind of use the MSRP, so that's why I did that. And you can kind of see here it's not the best performance per dollar. You know, Intel's Arc is technically the winner. So this is a technical win for Intel because it is so low priced. But, you know, you got to keep in mind the performance. So at $900 roughly, it's similar price per dollar to the old $400 5700 XT. It's a little bit more than the 6700 XT. So, yeah, so that's basically the result there. So the conclusion time, who is 7900 XT for? So just like I said in the ray tracing review, anybody that's on an older AMD GPU, like the ones we talked about, particularly flagship GPUs, so Radeon 7, Vega 64, these GPUs were relatively expensive back then. So Radeon 7 was a $700 GPU in 2019, early 2019. So you can kind of adjust for inflation, see like what that $700 would be in today's amount, and then you can kind of figure, well, is the 7900 XT still a relevant choice in terms of upgrading? Because I do think you get a massive performance uplift if you go from a Radeon 7 or a Vega 64 to one of these, or any old legacy flagship like the Fury or the Fury X or the 290X, although that GPU is like 9 years old now. But you get what I'm saying. And then for the NVIDIA side, it's the same deal. So if you're on a 1080 Ti and you're thinking of upgrading, this is a massive night and day difference going from a 1080 Ti to this. And then any older GPU like a 980 Ti, or even 20 series, like if you're on 2080, this is still a massive upgrade. 2080 Ti, this is still a massive upgrade. Because 2080 Ti is basically like a 6700 XT, and we saw the results for that GPU at 4K weren't that good. So, you know, if you're tired of paying the NVIDIA tax, because it's gotten out of control over the last couple of years now, so, you know, maybe it's worth considering going AMD. I feel like their GPUs are pretty solid. You know, I tested a bunch of them and never really had any problems. So, you know, if you're on a 1440p monitor, this is kind of a no-brainer. I would just get this and be done with it, rather than waiting around for who knows how long to try to get an XTX. Unless you really want the XTX, if you want that, then definitely hold out for that. But if you're on a 4K monitor, this is still good, although the XTX is probably the one that I would aim for if I was going to aim for 4K. So, you know, possibly anyone on a mid-range RDNA 2 or Ampere, like a 3060 or a 6600 XT, and you, for some reason, now have the money to spend on a higher-end GPU, then by all means, this is going to be a massive world of difference. I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say on this review. So if you like this content, please leave a like. It does motivate me to make more videos of this caliber. I will say that this is probably the review video that I have worked the most on. I didn't realize like how much time and effort it would go into benchmarking. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and get on out of here, guys. I appreciate you guys for watching. And if you have any questions on any of the tests or the GPUs, or if you have any kind of like questions about what's a good upgrade from, or should you upgrade to this or whatever, please leave a comment below and I'll try to answer it when I have time. And with that said, I'm going to go ahead and end the video. And once again, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Thanks.